Good morning and welcome, and thank you all for joining our webinar today. I'm going to be talking about the Agriculture Act 2020, and obviously for those of you who've already had a look through it, it's quite a long document along with the transition plan. So what I'm going to do is just focus on the specific sections outlining delinking payments and providing for the lump sum payments, which I think is what we would otherwise call capitalisation. And then I'm also going to have a little bit of a look at Schedule 3 of the Act, because that's where the amendments that relate to the Agricultural Holdings Act 1986 and the Agricultural Tenancies Act 1995 can be found. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Nichola Ross, and I'm part of the agribusiness sector based out of our Leeds office. Today, and for those who were joined early, you'll have seen the faces of our other panellists, Michael Aubrey, who I'm sure that most of you already know. He's a partner in our agribusiness sector, and we're also joined a little later by Jessica Burt. Now, for those of you who don't know Jessica, she is our expert on all things food law, labelling, compliance, and much more. And so we will all be taking some questions if you have any. If you want to put any questions to us all, then you can do so by using the Q&A function throughout the webinar. And what I should also just remind you is we have deactivated the chat function today. So please, you won't be able to use that, but do pop questions along as we go. What we've also got today is a couple of poll questions, so they'll be popping up a little bit later, and we'd appreciate your responses and in participating in those. Don't worry, they're just simple yes/no answers, so no brain power required. And finally, just to remind you all that this webinar is being recorded so that we can share it on our relevant social media platforms after the event and technology prevailing. However, as a reminder, only the speakers will be visible or audible on that recording. Right, so let's crack on and get into what we've all been waiting for, the Agricultural Act 2020. Finally in law, but as most of you will appreciate, not all in force as yet until the regulations are brought forward. And most commentary seems to anticipate that this will be sometime in 2021, which is a good thing given that the transition plan seems to point to quite a lot of consulting taking place and this idea of co-designing the next steps. But what I'm going to do this morning is just have a jump in and have a look at some of the sections of the Agriculture Act 2020. And what I've done is popped up on screen there some wording from section 12, which is the power to make delinked payments. This you can use for an aid memoir and just maybe have a look at a little bit more detailed when you get back to your desks after this webinar, if you like. Any underlining or highlighting is mine, not the Act. So this, as I said, as it says on screen, power to make delinked payment. And this will be made in accordance with the regulations to a person who is under the regulations entitled to receive it. And then these will be made within the delinking period. You can see there, sections B points to the delinking period being a period which will begin other than in 2021 and end on the last day of the agricultural transitional period. From the wording, it would seem that the persons could be undefined at the moment, and the regulations might point to certain classes of persons who would be entitled to delink, and then the regulations will also deal with the entitlement to receive a delinked payment. Now, I don't know if any of you were attending or have seen the Secretary of State on the Oxford Farming Conference webinar, but he spoke in that about an idea of having another reference period. So it is likely that the regulations might refer to reference periods of holding entitlements that would entitle people then again to take control of or take the opportunity to delinked payment. What I've now done is also put up some wording that comes in the Path to Sustainable Farming, the Agricultural Transition Plan. For those of you who've had a look at this, you'll know it's about 66 pages. And again, the Secretary of State said the first half of that was all about the journey, the second half being the detail. Well, in that, what I've just highlighted is there is this desire to formally consult on the plans to delink payment from the land for all farmers. And in the transition plan, he notes all farmers means anyone currently benefiting from payments. So it seems that the intention here is to include anyone taking entitlements at the moment and not necessarily shortening a class or of persons. And then he further says delinked payments will entirely replace the basic payment scheme for all farmers. So again, I think that's that intention to make sure delinking takes place sooner rather than later. And finally, at the bottom there, I should say the plan does make note to it being an intention to delink payments in 2024, which seems to be a definite direction of travel. And so I think out of this, and obviously we've got a long way to go and more to look at, but we need to remember the basic principle of delinking will be you do not have to own a single hectare of land to make those claims from 2024 to the end of the transition period. And so we'll probably need to have a think then about what that means in terms of will there be entitlements to trade in or from 2024 and what that might look like for landowners and other parts of the industry. If we just move on now to section 13, and this is the section headed Power to Provide for Lump Sum Payments in lieu of relevant payments. And I think this is the idea of capitalisation. Now, what I've done as well here in section 2, highlighted a couple of words. So this will be for a person who applies for a payment of a lump sum under the regulation. This is slightly different, I think, although we have to wait to see, to section 12, because the onus is on someone to claim this. And then moving on to B, someone has to be entitled to the relevant payment, and C, meets other eligibility conditions. So again, there is a sense that maybe there will be reference periods mentioned in regulations that will mean that somebody has to have had those entitlements for a set time. Now, if we move on to the subsection 4, there's also this additional subsection. Regulations under this section may make provision as to the circumstances in which a lump sum will be payable. And I think this is quite interesting and is slightly different again to section 12. And if we move on to what I've put up and pulled out of the transitional plan, I think this, and again, for those of you who maybe attended or saw the Secretary of State speak on that Oxford Farming Conference webinar, this seems to be pointing very strongly to this idea of retirement because, as you'll see there, this is a proposal to offer lump sum exit payments to farmers who wish to leave the sector. So clearly, or it seems to be a hint towards retirement. And he made that very strong sound bites around allowing unprofitable farmers to retire with dignity. They would need to meet relevant conditions, it goes on to say, including leaving the sector. So I think one thing to think about around here and around section 12 and delinking is the idea that you don't have to own any hectares in order to take your delinked payment, but in section 13, perhaps a stronger emphasis on leaving the sector. So possibly one of those circumstances or conditions might be something around not having brought forward any other kind of schemes onto any land, or having to actually have left the tenancy, left the holding, or sold the land. And finally, at the bottom there, one thing I've pulled out of the transition plan is this idea, I think, that this offer, the optional lump sum exit scheme payment in 2020. Now, looking at that transitional plan, I couldn't see any other dates highlighted in the schedule. They had a nice table in that, and there was just one little dot, 2022, which would suggest that they want to, or the idea of the road of travel is to have people brought to a point of retirement in 2022, prior to then dealing with everybody else left in the industry and moving into delinking. So there's a lot to think about and a lot to see coming through on regulations of how those work. So I think after that, it's probably time for a quick poll question. So from what I've summarized this morning and from what you've read and seen, I wonder whether, do you think that lump sum payments will be restricted to retiring farmers only? And that's just a simple yes or no. And I don't know if some of you have already jumped into my second question, in that, do you think that this is likely to incentivize large numbers of farmers to look to exit farming agreements in 2022? You're looking quite evenly split on number 2, where people think this will, but not everybody thinks that this will be restricted to retiring farmers. That's really interesting. Thank you for that. So moving on, and there's no slides because I'm going to just talk a little bit about Schedule 3 of the Act. I didn't put any slides up for Schedule 3, primarily because it's quite a long schedule and it deals with the amendments that will be made to the Agricultural Holdings Act 1986 and the Agricultural Tenancies Act 1995. And I think sometimes it's easier to wait for those to come online and see how those clauses are particularly amended, rather than just looking at wording that is saying things like substitute, etc. But what I wanted to do, excuse me, is just pull out a couple of things from that that will have an effect. The only one I think that affects both the Agricultural Holding Act 86 and the Agricultural Tenancies Act 1995 is this new way of appointing arbitrators, which is extended from just arbitrators to third parties as well, which extends this idea of other third-party professionals to not only the chair or not only the president of RICS, but also president or chair of the CAAV and the Agricultural Law Association. So they will have power to determine, and then that will also catch rent reviews. Within Schedule 3, there will be a new 19A going into the Agricultural Holding Act, and this relates to disputes relating to requests for landlord consent or variation to terms. So that where the tenant is given a right to refer a request to arbitration, or now third-party determination, there will be ruling coming along on whether the landlord was right or wrong, or probably wrong, to not consent to something under the terms of the tenancy. And further, they will have the right to impose a variation on certain terms of the tenancy. The purpose of this is stated to enable the tenant to request or apply for relevant financial assistance or relevant financial assistance of a description specified in the regulations, or to comply with statutory duties specified in the regulations. So you can see, I think, that the idea for this must be to get rid of some old clauses or redundant clauses that might stop an AHA tenant moving into the more environmental elements of the new scheme, rather than just perhaps food production. And also, what was interesting there, I think, is that the third-party determination can order the landlord to comply with the request. So there's again a sense of order there. And with that, this will include making an order for a variation in the rent of the holding. So we'll have to wait and see how this all pans out, and it's a bit early to tell, but I think you can see that one of the early questions there was if there was an order to vary the rent because of what was happening on the holding, perhaps a local nature restoration scheme, does that then become a rent review and restart your 3-year period? The other one I just want to pull out is on succession on death or retirement and conditions around relating to suitability. And here again, there is a brand new clause going into the Agricultural Holdings Act 1986 along the lines of the criteria that must be established and relate to the person's likely capacity to farm the holding commercially, to high standards of efficient production and care for the environment. So again, that's something that will probably come along and help flesh out this idea of environmental custodians. Added to that, effect has to be given to criteria relating to the person's experience, training or skills in agriculture or business management. Now, I think that sounds to me, although we still have to wait for the details, like a transferable skill. And again, if you happen to listen to that Secretary of State on that webinar, he very much made this case for fresh people coming into agriculture, and perhaps, and his example was someone who's left the holding to pursue a different career in the city, but now wants to come back for a lifestyle reason. So then looks like there may be some requirement to consider transferable skills in this criteria going forwards. And just, I think one more point just to note in passing is retirement age is being abolished. So again, perhaps pointing to the ability to get unprofitable farmers, even perhaps in a lower age range, moving out of the sector. So I think that really takes me on my fast and furious tour of the Act. And it's probably time now to bring in Michael and Jessica and to consider some questions. Jessica, if you're with us and off mute, here's one for you, which is probably quite topical, and it's on bird flu. Cases of bird flu have been reported in Yorkshire. How will the Agriculture Act help farmers in cases where their productivity is restricted by pandemics or other extreme circumstances?
Well, a very pertinent question because of the cases of bird flu that have been reported in England, and the restrictions that are put in place currently for bird producers, and also the fact that we are in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, and how these sort of virus outbreaks can affect everyone, but particularly our agricultural community. Looking at what the Culture Act particularly says in relation to this, there remains the bovine TB, the two schemes in relation to bovine TB, and there will be a animal health and welfare pathway livestock information program as well. So to help to collate information, to help to assist communications and assistance when these sort of outbreaks happen. And most interestingly, in the Agriculture Act, there is a Section 20 clause on exceptional market conditions. Now, how this will be applied is yet to be the nuts and bolts of it aren't set out. However, it talks about severe disturbances or the threat of severe disturbances in agricultural markets, and with this being a significant adverse effect on prices. So it will be interesting to see how that is actually applied alongside the section 22, where it gives the option to modify regulations in retained EU legislation. I know Boris is doing his best at the moment. And so there is a great deal of uncertainty around how this will be applied. But generally, practically, for farmers, we have provided updates on our food law blog on these outbreaks, and also advice on contingency planning for farmers. So please do check out our blog as well.
Thank you, Jessica. I think I've got another one for you, if you don't mind. There were concerns initially that the Agriculture Act was to make farmers more environmental custodians of the countryside rather than producers of food for the nation. And I think looking at some of those changes in the Agricultural Holdings Act, that looks like it's signified there. But how has concerns, or has this concern been adequately addressed in the Act from your perspective?
Well, yes, absolutely. It's the difficulty is that sort of the purpose behind agriculture is to provide the food, and particularly when the Agriculture Act was first as a bill, the predominant focus was on these public goods, and it was the sort of food security aspect got forgotten. So you had the sort of farmers going, hang on a sec, you know, we are farmers here. It has been met to a certain extent by provisions on food security, where every 3 years, starting next year, 2021, there will be a report provided by the government looking at global food availability, supply sources, the resilience of supply, household expenditure, and food safety. But it is very much my feel is this is second tier. This is a sop up, particularly when you look at the exit payments that have been pushed there. The main purpose behind payments does seem to be the environmental welfare side of things and the environmental side. But it's reassuring there is an element of food security that is put into the Act.
And possibly we'll need that even more if we get to no deal on Sunday. Anyway, let's have a look through, moving on. Michael, here's one for you, if you can make sure you're off mute. It's really aimed, I think, at FBTs and AHA tenancies. Should landlords be reviewing their tenancies now to see if there's any ability to stop tenants who are perhaps looking to retire from capitalising or applying for this lump sum payment?
Thank you, Nicola. In simple terms, yes, you should always review your terms of your tenancy, but your starting point, I would say, is what is the nature of the tenancy? If it's an AHA tenancy, then there's every chance that those entitlements will belong to the tenant, and the tenant will be freely entitled to deal with them however they see fit. I think I've only ever seen one tenancy, an AHA tenancy, which might touch a little bit on entitlements, and I think that was more by error in the drafting than anything else. But otherwise, the landlord can't influence how a tenant deals with those entitlements in an AHA tenancy. With an FBT, however, it's very different, and the agents on this webinar will know that there's been lots of clauses put in by both the RICS and the CAAV to deal with entitlements and leaving them or returning them back to the landlord at the end of the tenancy. But there is the issue then now with capitalisation, and the devil will be in the detail when the regulations are produced, as to the tenant may be able to say, well, actually, I am returning the entitlements to you. It's just I've stripped all the value out by taking a capitalised sum and walking away. So I think with FBTs, again, you should certainly be reviewing those FBTs. Probably if you've got an FBT that's for 30 years, then possibly less to worry about, because we'll probably be under a new regime again by then. But if you've got one between now and was going to come to an end between now and 2027, then I think, yes, you should be looking at it, and yes, you should be talking to your tenant, and again, working out whether the tenant is going to fall within one of the eligible criteria or satisfy the conditions under section 13 of the Act. So you would just need to look at that and see whether that there is a risk, because if you've got a young tenant who's in very entrepreneurial, the chances are they won't be looking to capitalize. But I think it's all about communicating with the tenant and keeping a good relationship and dialogue going.
And just another question in, Michael, which probably for you or I is one question is how far down do we think rents could drop over the next 4 years? I'm not really sure we're qualified to answer that, but I think I don't know if you've got a view on that.
Well, there's always been talk about rents falling if all the subsidies and support payments go, but there is an element, and I would defer to the valuers on this, but they're not. It's the entitlements may be going, but they're going to be broadly replaced by other agri-environment schemes. Elms will be coming in and various other things. So I think there may be a reduction, but I think it's probably the nature of farming. I still think smaller farmers will struggle unless they can diversify. I think those with sort of upland traditional AHA tenancies will struggle unless the environmental land management scheme does actually allow them to do other things. But the entrepreneurial farmer, I think, will always survive. But coming back to the question, will rents suffer? They probably will go down a little bit, but I think probably not as far as people will predict.
And just one final question, I think, for Jessica, because someone had to ask. Chlorinated chicken, what protection, in a sense, what protections are there in the Agricultural Act against cheap third country food imports that do not meet UK standards, both environmentally and welfare, i.e. this chlorinated chicken from the US?
Absolutely. I mean, chlorinated chicken has become the hand for the fear of cheaper imports that don't need to have such high standards on the environment side, on the welfare side, all the restrictions that UK agriculture, the high standards that they have to meet. And there's the fear about cheap imports coming in. The NFU pushed really hard to see if they could impose restrictions, and MPs did not pass blanket restrictions on trade deals allowing this. What they did provide was for a Trade and Agriculture Committee, a commission that would actually scrutinise and provide a report that would then have 21 days to be reviewed before there was any signing of these sorts of trade deals with third parties. The commission will be made up of members of the NFU, other independent experts as well. So I'm quite reassured it will be an independent commission. The amount of importance that these reports are given by Parliament, it will be up to lobbying, it will be up to every individual member to ensure that their own interests are looked. And there is going to be a level of uncertainty. However, equally in the food side of things, we are, as a sort of brighter point, we are seeing much more owners, much more emphasis on country of origin, sustainability, and for the public to really want to buy British. I know that the supply chains and the logistics have been incredibly difficult, both with the coronavirus and looking forward to what the supply chains will be after the transition period has ended from January onwards. So, I mean, that is something to think about, that the sustainability and the country of origin claims, there is the impetus to want that from the British public.
All right. Well, thank you, Jessica. We are slightly over time, so I will wrap it up now. I just wanted to thank you all for giving us your time and signing on today. And I know this is a very busy period running up to Christmas for a lot of you. Just to reiterate, providing all the technology has worked correctly, we'll pop a copy of this recording into your inbox soon. And we'll have a look at your responses to those little couple of straw polls to see who was right, really, I suppose, in the next 3 or 4 years. Once again, thank you very much for joining us this morning, and goodbye.